The racist and corrupt cops disrespected the black FBI agent in court, but minutes later they found themselves in handcuffs, and what happened to them left everyone shocked and speechless. It all started on a day that was supposed to be about justice, but turned into public humiliation. A courtroom filled with murmurs and tension. A federal agent walks in, dressed in a suit, badge in hand, carrying a sealed federal warrant. The atmosphere changes the moment he steps through the door. Some recognize him. Some pretend not to. But a group of local police officers, seated arrogantly on the side like kings in their own kingdom, begin whispering, smirking. The silence breaks with a voice full of venom and ignorance. "You're no FBI. You're just another thug in a suit pretending to be somebody." Laughter erupts. Heads turn. A moment of confusion, then discomfort. He remains composed. He approaches with purpose. But as he tries to hand the officer the official documents, one of them snatches it aggressively, glances at it for no more than 2 seconds, then rips it in half and lets it fall to the ground. "You think you're gonna walk in here and give orders? This is our town, boy," the officer says loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear. More laughter follows. A few gasps. No one dares to intervene. Not even the judge speaks up. For a moment, the courtroom becomes a theater of silent approval. The agent stands still, humiliated, his authority dismissed, his presence reduced to nothing but a target of mockery. Not because of his work. Not because of anything he said. But because of who he was, and what they saw when they looked at him. He wasn't mistaken for a criminal. He was deliberately treated like one. With malice. With the deep, confident entitlement of men who truly believed they were untouchable. That courtroom wasn't just a place of law, it had become a stage for power games, and the audience had no idea they were watching the first act of something much bigger. See, what those officers didn't know, was that the man they humiliated had been watching them long before they noticed him. His presence in that courtroom wasn't a coincidence. He hadn't come alone. And that warrant they tore apart wasn't just paper, it was bait. Years of investigations. Months of silent wiretaps. A trail of complaints buried, destroyed, or ignored. A pattern of targeted arrests, illegal searches, planted evidence, all protected by a shield of silence and brotherhood. But silence has cracks. And in those cracks, the truth leaks out. That truth had a face, and it was standing right in front of them. Disrespected. Dismissed. But not defeated. As the trial proceeded, eyes rolled, jokes continued, and smug faces looked on. They laughed, even as they lied under oath. They sneered, even as they distorted facts. But across the room, he sat quietly. Watching. Listening. Until the moment arrived. A single nod from him. A signal. Doors opened. Federal agents swarmed in. The laughter died instantly. The judge froze. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as one by one, those same officers were handcuffed in front of the entire court. The same man they mocked was now watching them fall, not with vengeance, but with calm authority. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. They had mocked his badge. Questioned his right to stand where he stood. But in the end, it was that very badge that brought them down. They had forgotten one crucial thing: truth doesn't need permission to be told. And now, the world would finally see what they had been hiding all along. But here's the thing. What exactly did the agent do before walking into that courtroom? How did he manage to orchestrate their downfall without anyone noticing? What secrets did he uncover, and who else was involved? One thing's certain, they thought they were untouchable. Until they weren't. Stay until the end. Because the twist you're about to hear changes everything. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism, discrimination, or injustice. If you're a black viewer watching this, we see you, we hear you, and we stand with you. Your story, your strength, and your dignity matter, always. This channel believes in justice, in truth, and in the power of real stories that shake the soul. You're not alone, and this story is for you. Now, get ready for a roller coaster of emotion, justice, and shocking twists. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to Plow of Twist and turn on notifications. You're not gonna want to miss this. Enjoy the story. The streets of Richmond, Virginia held a quiet tension just beneath the surface, a city with deep roots and even deeper scars. On its face, it moved like any other, courtrooms full, traffic lights flickering in routine rhythm, and small businesses trying to survive. But behind the brick buildings and the historical charm, the justice system was slowly rotting from the inside. And no one knew that better than Special Agent Elijah Brooks. Elijah was the kind of man you noticed, not because he was loud, or flashy, but because he carried himself with a presence that demanded respect without saying a word. Tall, broad-shouldered, with deep brown skin and eyes that studied everything with quiet calculation, he'd worked his way through systems that were never built for men like him. From a young age, he understood that being excellent wasn't enough. He had to be flawless. Impeccable. Always 10 steps ahead. That was the only way he'd survive. And survive he did, graduating top of his class from Quantico, navigating high-stakes undercover missions, and becoming one of the youngest federal agents ever assigned to lead an internal affairs operation. But what most people didn't know about Elijah was that his calm demeanor wasn't born from natural temperament, it was carved through years of swallowing rage, bottling humiliation, and watching lesser men with louder voices get credit for work he'd done in silence. Every case closed had come with a price. Every room he entered as a black federal agent came with eyes that doubted him, colleagues who smiled through gritted teeth, and superiors who never quite saw him as one of them. Yet Elijah never flinched. He wore every insult like armor. Because he knew his time would come. And when it did, he would be ready. He lived alone in a small but clean apartment downtown, surrounded by books, case files, and a kitchen that hadn't seen a real meal in weeks. His life was work, meticulously structured, driven by a quiet obsession with justice. Not vengeance. Justice. There was a difference. Elijah wasn't reckless. He wasn't impulsive. He planned. He waited. And right now, he was waiting for the perfect moment to bring down a system of abuse that had gone unchecked for far too long. The target of his investigation. The Richmond Police Department's 9th District, a division plagued with whispers of corruption, excessive force, falsified reports, and a string of civilian complaints that never seemed to stick. At the center of it were 3 officers who had, for years, built their own empire of intimidation: Sergeant Kyle Reamer, Officer Brent Doyle, and Lieutenant Matt Eckhart. Reamer was the unofficial leader, a thick-necked, red-faced bulldog of a man who walked like every space belonged to him. He'd been on the force for nearly 2 decades, with more misconduct accusations than commendations, but none of them had ever gone anywhere. Somehow, every complaint disappeared. Every witness changed their story. He smiled at press conferences, but behind closed doors, he was a bully with a badge, and everyone knew it. Doyle was younger, slicker, and far more dangerous in Elijah's eyes. The kind of cop who could fake empathy when the cameras were on and then plant a weapon on a teenager minutes later. He dressed sharp, spoke with false humility, and used his charm like a blade. He was especially skilled at gaslighting victims, making them question their own memory, their own truth. Doyle was the type who could destroy someone and make them say thank you afterward. Then there was Eckhart. Cold. Silent. Calculating. The highest ranking of the 3, and by far the most difficult to pin down. He never got his hands dirty directly, but nothing happened without his approval. Elijah believed Eckhart was the one who had buried complaints, moved evidence, and pulled strings within the department. He was the real engine behind the machine. And bringing him down would be the key to dismantling the entire corrupt structure. Elijah had been gathering intel on the 3 for over a year, digging through sealed files, interviewing frightened ex-cops, and following patterns of abuse that stretched far beyond public records. What he found disgusted him. There were undocumented arrests, citizens beaten into silence, and even surveillance footage that had mysteriously disappeared after certain incidents. Victims had been coerced, families threatened, and any officer who dared speak up was quickly transferred or fired under vague performance claims. But even with all the evidence Elijah had collected, he knew he couldn't just present it in a file. These men were too protected. They had friends in high places. So he devised a plan, one that would take time, patience, and precision. He would use the justice system they thought they owned to expose them. And that meant waiting for the right case, the right courtroom, and the right moment to make his move. That case came in the form of a young black man named Karen Tate, arrested after being stopped randomly near a grocery store. No warrant, no cause. Just a suspicious look. Within minutes, Karen was face down on the pavement, knee in his back, handcuffed, and accused of assaulting an officer. The officers involved? Reamer, Doyle, and Eckhart's unit. The charge was absurd. The force used? Brutal. But what made this case different was that Karen's cousin had been filming from across the street. The video showed everything, and when it went viral, the department had no choice but to move forward with a trial. Elijah saw his opening. He got himself assigned to assist in the federal oversight of the case, which gave him access to the trial and a reason to be in that courtroom. Officially, he was there to observe. Unofficially, he was watching everyone, recording, documenting, and preparing to reveal the extent of the corruption. He wasn't there just to testify. He was there to finish what he started. But things didn't go as planned. The moment he entered that courtroom, all eyes were on him, not because they recognized him, but because of who they assumed he wasn't. He walked in wearing his badge, carrying sealed documents, ready to submit federal evidence that would assist the prosecution. But before he even reached the bench, he was stopped by Reamer, who was seated like a king at the defense table. The exchange was immediate, loud, and cruel. Reamer's voice cut through the courtroom like a sneer wrapped in steel. "Let me guess, delivery guy. You lost, son." When Elijah calmly identified himself as a federal agent and attempted to submit the warrant, Doyle laughed, loud, obnoxious, and turned to the crowd. "You hear that? This guy says he's FBI. I didn't know the Bureau started hiring guys off the street." Laughter filled the room. Eckhart stayed silent. Watching. Calculating. And then, without even reading the document, Reamer took it from Elijah's hand, looked him dead in the eyes, and slowly ripped it in half. The pieces fluttered to the floor like falling ash. "You don't run things here," he said. "I do." No one stopped him. Not the judge. Not the bailiff. Not the prosecution. It was a moment so surreal it felt rehearsed. But it wasn't. It was real. And Elijah stood there, humiliated, the courtroom now a theater of mockery, his authority questioned, his dignity publicly dragged through the mud. Not because he had done anything wrong. But because, in their eyes, a black man with power was a threat that needed to be humiliated. And yet, he said nothing. He picked up the torn papers without emotion. He walked to his seat. He waited. Because what they didn't know was that Elijah had planned for this. He had predicted their arrogance. Counted on it. And what came next, would not just change the course of one trial, but shake the very foundation of the entire Richmond Police Department. But here's the question. What kind of man watches his own humiliation unfold, and doesn't react? What does he know that gives him the strength to stay silent? And what is it that made those officers go from laughing at him, to wearing handcuffs in that same courtroom minutes later? Stay with me. The truth behind what happened next will leave you speechless. Elijah Brooks sat in the narrow hallway outside the courtroom, elbows on his knees, fingers interlocked, head slightly bowed, not out of defeat, but deep calculation. The air was heavy. The faint buzz of fluorescent lights hummed overhead as people shuffled by, glancing at him, quickly turning their heads. The humiliation he had endured inside that room minutes earlier was still fresh in the air. But for Elijah, it had only confirmed what he already knew. These men didn't just believe they were above the law, they believed they were the law. Their boldness, their lack of fear, their open contempt, it was all part of a pattern. And now, he was done watching. Now, things were moving. Not just inside the courtroom, but far beyond it. Inside, the trial resumed. Karen Tate sat nervously beside his defense attorney, fidgeting with his fingers, eyes darting around, clearly overwhelmed. The young man had barely turned 22. He had never been in a courtroom before, and now he was being painted as a violent threat to society. His voice trembled earlier on the stand. The trauma of that day, the brutality, the insults, the hand pressing his face to the concrete, still haunted him. But no one seemed to care. Not really. The judge looked tired. The prosecutor disinterested. The defense was doing what it could, but the room felt weighed down by a quiet assumption, that the badge would win. It always did. Elijah entered quietly again, this time without a file in hand, without any expression. He sat in the back, eyes focused, not on the judge, not on the jury, but on the three officers seated near the front. Reamer sat with his legs spread wide, arms crossed, chewing gum with exaggerated force. Doyle leaned back, smirking every time the defense attorney spoke. Eckhart, as always, was still. Unbothered. Hands folded neatly, watching every movement in the room like a chess master who'd already won the game. During recess, Elijah was approached by Maya Jennings, one of the assistant federal prosecutors working on the oversight team. She was young, brilliant, and one of the few people Elijah trusted. Her eyes were sharp with quiet fury as she sat beside him in the empty hallway, flipping through her tablet. "You really think they're going to get away with this again?" she asked, not hiding the bitterness in her voice. Elijah didn't look at her, but his voice was steady. "No," he said. "Because we're not playing their game anymore. We're playing mine." Maya turned to face him, curious. "What are you not telling me?" He finally met her eyes. "Enough to change everything." Later that day, Doyle took the stand. His testimony was filled with polished lies, designed to sound like fact. He spoke confidently, referring to Karen as the suspect, instead of by name, describing how he aggressively resisted arrest, how the situation escalated, and how he and Reamer were forced to use reasonable force. Every word was rehearsed, deliberate. The prosecutor let him speak uninterrupted, and the judge nodded as though it all made sense. But the energy shifted when the defense cross-examined him. Karen's attorney, a sharp and relentless woman named Gloria Thomas, began with small questions. Dates. Times. Weather conditions. Doyle answered with ease. Then she pressed him on details, minor discrepancies in his report. A few things didn't line up. The angle of the takedown. The position of the car. Doyle's smirk faded for the first time. He began to fumble slightly. Not much. But enough. Enough for the jury to notice. Back in the hallway, Gloria passed by Elijah and gave him a small nod. There was a quiet understanding between them. She didn't know the full scope of what Elijah was planning, but she could sense that something was building. The atmosphere felt different now. Like the ground beneath the courtroom was beginning to shift. Elijah spent that evening at his apartment, reviewing footage. Not just from Karen's case, but from dozens of others. He had walls filled with names, dates, maps, and timelines. One by one, they connected, every illegal stop, every falsified report, every silenced complaint. And always, the same names circled back into the center. Reamer. Doyle. Eckhart. The pattern was no longer just visible. It was undeniable. He opened a secure communication line and checked in with his internal team. They were spread across several states, working quietly, undercover, embedded. Elijah had built a small task force of trusted agents who had been collecting independent pieces of the puzzle. Now, those pieces were starting to fit together. The next day, the tension inside the courtroom was nearly physical. Elijah could feel it in the way people sat more upright, how whispers died quicker than before. Something was coming, and though they didn't know what, they could feel it approaching. As Gloria called her next witness, Maya slipped into the courtroom and sat beside Elijah. She leaned in, whispered, "I got the confirmation. Everything's in place." Elijah didn't flinch. "Keep eyes on the back doors. When it happens, it'll be fast." Eckhart looked back. Just for a second. He caught Elijah's gaze. There was no smile. No smirk. Just a long, silent stare. A look that said he knew something was off, but didn't quite know what. Yet. Outside, black SUVs idled quietly on the street. Inside them, federal agents waited. No sirens. No announcements. Just silent readiness. Meanwhile, Karen's cousin, who had recorded the video of the arrest, was finally allowed to testify. His voice shook as he described what he saw. He spoke about the way Reamer slammed Karen to the ground, how Doyle laughed while cuffing him, how Eckhart never once stepped in. As he spoke, tears welled in his eyes. "I thought they were gonna kill him," he said. "I was scared to move. I thought they'd come for me too." The room was dead silent. No one laughed now. Elijah watched as the officers shifted uncomfortably. Not much. But enough. Enough for him to know that they felt the walls closing in. During the next break, Elijah stood alone near a window, looking out at the city he had grown to both love and resent. Richmond was beautiful in the way old cities are, its buildings wore history like skin. But that history carried pain. And beneath that pain was a refusal to acknowledge how much still hadn't changed. But maybe, just maybe, this moment could start to shift something. Maya joined him again. "They're all in place. Audio, video, warrants, agents. All we need now, is the cue." Elijah nodded. His voice was quiet. "Let them hang themselves a little more. Then we pull the floor." Back in the courtroom, the trial continued. The jury looked more alert. The judge, perhaps for the first time, seemed unsure. The prosecution grew quieter. And the defense? They were starting to sense it too. Something was coming. Something they hadn't planned for. And Elijah? He sat still, eyes calm, heart steady, watching everything unfold like the conductor of a silent storm. But here's the thing. No one in that room, not the officers, not the jury, not even the judge, knew that what they were witnessing wasn't just a trial. It was the final scene before a reckoning. And when the truth dropped, it wouldn't come softly. It would crash like thunder. Now the question is, what exactly did Elijah do behind the scenes? And why are the officers who humiliated him about to face something they never saw coming? The storm is almost here. The courtroom was still. Too still. The kind of stillness that only happens right before something breaks. Every seat was filled, but no one moved. The weight in the air was almost physical, like the pressure before a storm hits. Gloria had just finished her final questioning, and the defense table sat in eerie silence. Reamer leaned back, arms crossed, trying to wear confidence like armor, but there was something different in his posture now, less swagger, more tension. Doyle no longer smiled. He stared ahead, eyes fixed, jaw tight. Eckhart barely blinked, but his fingers tapped against his thigh in a slow, almost imperceptible rhythm. Elijah sat at the far end, eyes calm, hands folded. He didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He had already seen everything he needed. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to dismiss the court for lunch recess, when a voice rang out from the gallery, measured, authoritative, unshaken. Your Honor, before recess, may I request the court's permission to submit new federal evidence related directly to the integrity of this trial? Every head turned. Elijah was standing. Slowly, firmly, holding a sealed folder in one hand. His badge shone clearly now, FBI gold against a dark navy suit. He wasn't asking. He was already moving forward. The judge blinked, caught off guard. Agent Brooks. This is highly unorthodox. This trial is under state jurisdiction. What exactly are you trying to? I believe the court will want to hear what's on this audio file before you make any further decisions. Elijah placed a flash drive on the evidence table, his voice calm, steady, but with a sharp edge that cut through the room. I respectfully request 5 minutes. The judge hesitated, looking to the prosecution, who was already flipping through notes in confusion. Then to Gloria, who gave a subtle nod of support. Finally, the judge sighed and motioned toward the technician. Proceed. Let's hear it. The audio clicked on. And the room fell into stunned silence. At first, the voices were muffled. Then clearer. Familiar. It was Doyle. I'm telling you, man, this kid was perfect. Nobody's gonna believe him. Black hoodie, pants sagging, looked just like the others. I had to do it. Then Reamer's voice joined in, laughing. Shut up, Brent. You plant the knife like I told you. Of course I did. You think I'm new at this? You better hope that damn video doesn't get out. I've got Eckhart breathing down my neck, he wants this clean. He says if the feds catch wind of this one, we're screwed. Then silence. A beat. And Eckhart's voice entered, cold and sharp. If that kid's cousin keeps running his mouth, I'll handle it. One way or another. Gasps filled the courtroom. Reamer jumped to his feet. That's fake. That's fake audio. Doyle's face was pale. He looked like he'd stopped breathing. Eckhart stood slowly, his hand clenched. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Sit down, Sergeant Reamer. But Elijah wasn't done. He stepped forward again, placing a second document on the table. That audio was recorded by an undercover agent embedded in Officer Doyle's patrol car during a previous investigation. It was never meant for public release, but when this case came to light, the Department of Justice authorized its use. That's not all. He pulled up a live video feed on the monitor. Right now, federal agents are executing arrest warrants on Sergeant Reamer, Officer Doyle, and Lieutenant Eckhart for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, falsifying evidence, and multiple counts of civil rights violations. As if on cue, the double doors at the back of the courtroom burst open. 3 federal agents entered, badges displayed, weapons holstered. The room erupted. The audience stood, some shouting, others filming. Gloria turned and covered her mouth in shock. Maya watched from the corner, her eyes locked on Elijah, tears welling but refusing to fall. The judge called for order, but his voice was drowned by the chaos. The agents approached the defense table. Kyle Reamer, Brent Doyle, Matthew Eckhart, you are under arrest by the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation. You can't do this, Eckhart hissed, stepping back. I have rights. I'm a lieutenant, one of the agents stepped forward, unbothered. You had rights. Now you have the right to remain silent. Reamer shoved a chair, Doyle shouted that it was a setup, and Eckhart turned to Elijah with a look that wasn't rage, but betrayal. Pure, cold betrayal. You set us up, he said, low, venomous. Elijah didn't flinch. You set yourself up, he replied. All I did was make sure everyone finally heard the truth. The 3 were cuffed. One by one, led out past the same people they had once walked past like gods. Reporters scrambled outside. Phones were lifted. The community that had once been silent, too afraid, too hopeless, was suddenly alive. Elijah remained still as they passed him. Reamer stopped for just a second, turned, and spat the words, "This doesn't end here." Elijah looked him straight in the eye. "It already has." As the door closed behind them, the silence returned, but this time, it was different. Not tense. Not heavy. But stunned. Charged. Transformative. The judge stared at Elijah for a long moment. "Agent Brooks, will your office be assuming jurisdiction over the remainder of this case?" Elijah nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Effective immediately. The gavel came down again. And just like that, the trial had changed. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered. People who had followed the case from afar. Those who had been afraid to speak. Now they had names. Faces. Voices. But Elijah didn't walk out the front doors. He remained inside, sitting alone at the same bench where he had been humiliated just days earlier. Maya joined him, quietly sitting beside him. "You did it," she said. Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked forward, hands clasped again, the same posture he had taken when all of this began. "No," he finally said. "We just started." Because now, with the truth out, he knew exactly how deep the corruption went. And this was only the beginning. Elijah stayed behind in the courtroom long after the crowd had cleared, long after the buzz of chaos outside began to fade into muffled sirens and camera flashes. He sat in silence, the room now hollow without the noise of voices, boots, and judgments. The judge had left in quiet disbelief, the jury had been dismissed indefinitely, and even Gloria, who had stood so tall moments ago, now leaned against the far wall, her expression unreadable as she watched Elijah from a distance. He looked toward the defendant's bench, where Karen Tate had sat, where his whole life had nearly been ruined by lies, and Elijah let himself feel the weight of everything he'd held back for the past year. The fight for truth was never easy, never clean. It left bruises beneath the skin, invisible scars that only the soul could trace. But today was different. Today, truth had broken through. Maya approached slowly, her heels echoing on the marble floor. She carried with her a kind of careful reverence, like she knew this moment wasn't one to be interrupted lightly. When she sat beside him, she didn't speak at first. Her presence alone was enough for a while. Then she leaned in, voice low, but steady, as if trying not to disturb the fragile silence that had settled between them. "You were brilliant, Elijah. Everything you built, it worked." He gave a faint nod, his eyes still locked on the empty space where Reamer had once sat with that arrogant grin. "It wasn't brilliance," he said finally, his voice tired but firm. "It was necessity. I had no choice. If I didn't do it this way, they would have buried it." Again. Maya turned her head to look at him, her face softening. "But you carried that burden alone. You let them humiliate you. Tear your dignity apart. You didn't even flinch." Elijah let out a quiet breath, a bitter chuckle. "You think I haven't flinched? I flinched every night I went home and stared at walls covered in names of people who trusted the system and were betrayed by it. I flinched every time I sat across from a mother begging for someone to believe her son wasn't a thug. I flinched when I walked into rooms where my own badge didn't mean a damn thing because of the color of my skin. I've flinched more than I can count. But I stopped showing it. Because flinching in front of them means they win." He paused, eyes flicking to the now dormant screen where the audio had played. "And now I don't have to flinch anymore." Maya reached out, resting a hand over his. For a moment, he allowed it, let the warmth of connection remind him that he wasn't alone in this. That maybe, just maybe, change was possible if they kept pushing. "You gave that courtroom something they'd never seen before," she said. "Accountability." Elijah looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his gaze cracked, just a sliver. "I didn't do it for them," he said. I did it for every kid like Karen. For every name on my wall. For every person who never got their day in court. I did it for the silence that's been screaming for too damn long. Outside, the air had changed. The press circled the courthouse like vultures, trying to catch pieces of what had just unfolded. Community members stood together, some crying, some embracing, others just staring, stunned. Karen emerged with Gloria by his side, blinking against the flashing lights, overwhelmed but finally seen. For the first time since his arrest, someone was standing behind him, not to push him down, but to hold him up. A reporter called out, "Karen, how does it feel to know they've been arrested?" His voice was quiet, almost too soft for the microphone. "Like I can breathe again." Inside, Elijah finally stood, pulling his badge from his pocket and turning it over in his hand. Maya followed his eyes as they traced the letters, FBI. 3 letters that had opened doors and slammed them shut in equal measure. "You think they'll stay locked up?" she asked. "You think this will actually stick?" Elijah exhaled through his nose. "It'll stick if we don't stop. If we keep going. There are more. You know that." "I know that." Maya nodded. "Then let's finish what we started." Just as they turned to leave, the courtroom door opened and Gloria stepped in, her eyes sharp, focused, but not with suspicion, this time, with something else. "Elijah," she said, "the DOJ just released the files you submitted. It's bigger than we thought. Way bigger." He froze. "How big?" Gloria swallowed. "There's a financial trail. Payoffs. Internal memos. Cover-ups going back almost a decade. Eckhart wasn't the end. He was the gatekeeper." Elijah's face darkened, not with fear, but resolve. "Then we just kicked the first door open." Gloria handed him the envelope, her fingers brushing his. "You were right. The system's deeper than anyone wants to admit. But this? This is the start of something they can't ignore anymore." Elijah opened the envelope, eyes scanning the documents, connecting names and dots he had suspected but never confirmed. "We're not done," he muttered. "Not even close." Maya looked between them. "We take this upstairs." Elijah nodded. "We take it everywhere. Washington, Atlanta, Chicago, anywhere this trail leads. We follow it until there's nothing left to expose." Gloria smiled faintly. "And when we find the ones protecting them?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "We expose them too." The 3 of them walked out together, the weight of the courthouse still behind them, but now balanced by the fire of what was coming. As they stepped into the light, the crowd turned. Silence fell again, but this time, it was a silence of recognition. Of respect. Of something shifting. A woman near the front, with tears running down her face, whispered just loud enough to be heard. "He stood alone, and he brought them down." Elijah looked at her, nodded once, then turned his eyes to the horizon beyond the city buildings. He knew this wasn't over. He knew the fight was just beginning. But now he wasn't alone. And the system that had protected corruption for years? It had just been cracked wide open. The drive back to the Richmond field office was quiet. Elijah sat in the passenger seat of the unmarked SUV, staring out the window as buildings passed in a blur, his mind already moving faster than the traffic. Maya was at the wheel, her hands steady, eyes locked ahead, but the silence between them was not discomfort, it was contemplation. The storm had passed, at least on the surface, but now came the reckoning. The arrests in the courtroom had cracked the dam, but what followed was a flood of calls, emails, panicked officials trying to protect their own names as the evidence began to unravel decades of silence. And beneath it all, Elijah felt the weight of something more dangerous than any one corrupt officer, the quiet complicity of an entire system. Back at headquarters, the bullpen was buzzing. Phones ringing, agents pacing, analysts pulling threads that now connected Richmond to departments in neighboring counties. The financial records Gloria had handed Elijah turned out to be just a glimpse: accounting ledgers, wire transfers, donations funneled through shell foundations. Some of the names on the documents were familiar to Elijah. Others made his blood run cold. Judges, prosecutors, community leaders who had stood on stages promising reform while quietly taking checks from police unions with bloody fingerprints. In the conference room, Elijah stood before a whiteboard crowded with names, dates, lines connecting people like a web of deceit woven over years. Maya pinned new documents beside photos. Gloria read off the details. One name came up repeatedly: Chief Daryl Monroe, the top of the Richmond Police Department. Publicly known for championing diversity and community policing, he had built a national reputation as a reformer. But the paper trail showed something else. Campaign contributions linked to Doyle's stepbrother. Phone logs showing frequent communication with Eckhart. Direct oversight over internal affairs complaints that never went anywhere. A man who smiled for the press and handed out medals while sweeping bodies under the rug. The revelation struck something in Elijah he wasn't ready for. He had met Monroe. Had shaken his hand. Had believed, in the early years of his career, that the chief was someone who represented a new kind of leadership. But belief, he realized now, was a dangerous thing. Because belief without proof is just a gamble, and he had gambled on the wrong man. That night, Elijah sat alone in his apartment again. The walls of files, photos, and maps had grown. But his focus wasn't on the evidence anymore, it was on the question that kept repeating in his head. What if bringing down Reamer, Doyle, and Eckhart wasn't enough? What if exposing the corruption only created a vacuum for something worse to fill? He stared at a photo of Monroe, freshly pinned above a document that detailed a mysterious budget increase for a community policing initiative that had never materialized. The money vanished. And Elijah had a good idea where it had gone. He got up, pacing the room, struggling with the realization that the truth he'd fought to bring into the light had now opened a door into something darker. He wanted to believe in justice. But justice, he now understood, wasn't a straight line. It was tangled, uneven, and often came with unintended consequences. If he took Monroe down, it wouldn't just shake the department, it would destroy public faith in a system that was already hanging by threads. Could the community survive another betrayal? Would people lose hope completely if even the man they thought was on their side turned out to be part of the rot? The next morning, Elijah met Maya and Gloria at a federal office on the outskirts of the city. It was quieter, away from the press, away from prying eyes. They gathered in a windowless room with one long table and nothing but hard decisions on it. "We go public with Monroe," Gloria said, laying out the case. "We've got enough. Emails, transfers, witness statements from 3 former officers." Maya looked at Elijah, her eyes cautious. "If we do this, the fallout won't be small. The community's going to feel betrayed. Again. This could turn everything we've gained against us." Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked down at the files in front of him, the pages that represented hours, months, years of work. Then he leaned forward, voice low. "If we know the truth and we don't say it, aren't we part of the same machine we're trying to dismantle?" Silence settled over the room. Heavy. Uncomfortable. But honest. They decided to move carefully. First, secure the evidence. Then prepare the community. Bring in trusted activists, community leaders, people who had the ear of the streets. They needed to create a space where the truth wouldn't just explode, it could be processed, understood, owned. Not just by the justice system, but by the people it was supposed to serve. Meanwhile, the backlash to the courtroom arrests began to grow. Certain news outlets painted the agents as overreaching and disrespectful to state law enforcement. Some called Elijah a rogue operative, a man with a vendetta against police. Online, conspiracy theories erupted, and threats began to trickle into federal servers. But the other side was louder. Community groups rallied in front of the courthouse. Families came forward, holding photos of sons and daughters wrongfully imprisoned or killed. For every lie that was exposed, a new voice rose to share the truth. What Elijah had started was now bigger than him. Still, doubt lingered. In private moments, he questioned himself. Had he crossed lines that shouldn't have been crossed? Could he have done this another way, one that didn't humiliate, didn't burn bridges so completely? But then he remembered Karen. He remembered the tape. The laugh. The slam. The silence. And he knew that if he had hesitated, the system would have buried it again. Truth required friction. And sometimes, that friction meant fire. 1 week later, the DOJ approved full investigation into Monroe and members of his inner circle. Elijah was assigned to lead the inquiry. A press conference was scheduled. As he stood behind the curtain, notes in hand, cameras buzzing beyond the stage, he felt the weight of everything on his shoulders. Not just the facts. Not just the evidence. But the trust of a people who had watched justice slip through their fingers too many times to count. He turned to Maya. "Once I say this, there's no going back." She nodded, placing a hand on his arm. "You didn't come this far to go back." The curtain rose. And Elijah stepped into the light. But before he could speak, his phone buzzed. A message. No name. Just a number. "You think you've won. But you've only scratched the surface." He looked out at the cameras, the microphones, the people waiting to hear the truth. And he knew, in that instant, that what was coming, would make everything so far look like a prologue. The message haunted Elijah more than he cared to admit. Even as he stood in front of the press, delivering what should have been a moment of triumph, a public declaration of a full-scale federal investigation into the Richmond Police Department's top officials, his mind kept circling back to those words. "You think you've won. But you've only scratched the surface." It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning, one spoken with the kind of certainty that could only come from someone who knew exactly how deep the rot went. And yet, as the cameras clicked and reporters hurled questions with desperate urgency, Elijah's voice didn't waver. He laid out the facts with precision, naming names, dates, and misconduct with surgical clarity. There was no room for ambiguity. The public deserved the truth, and today, they were getting it, piece by piece, wound by wound. After the press conference, the agents filed out in waves, and Elijah found himself alone for a moment in the hallway of the federal building, leaning against the cool concrete wall. The adrenaline was starting to drain, leaving behind the heavy ache of exhaustion. He had cracked something open, and now everyone was watching to see if he could hold the line as everything spilled out. Maya approached quietly, a folder tucked under her arm, eyes searching his face. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't have to. Her silence was the kind that understood pain without needing to name it. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but the words cut deep. "We found something else." Elijah looked up, already bracing. Maya handed him the folder, her fingers lingering on the edge. "You need to read this for yourself." He opened it slowly, eyes scanning the contents, and with each page, his stomach twisted tighter. There, buried in coded transactions and reworded contracts, was a name he never expected to see, Marcus Lyle, a childhood friend. A man who had once marched with Elijah in college protests, who had spoken out in community meetings and called for justice through a bullhorn when the city refused to listen. Now, his name was linked to a private security firm contracted by the city, one that funneled money into campaign donations and provided consulting to officers involved in questionable arrests. Elijah's chest tightened. He remembered sitting on Marcus's porch after high school, talking about building a world that was better than the one they'd inherited. He remembered the fire in Marcus's eyes, the way he spoke about resistance and revolution. And now, that same fire had been sold to the highest bidder. Maya watched his expression shift. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice low. "I know you were close." Elijah closed the folder, jaw clenched. "Not close enough, apparently." That evening, Elijah stood outside Marcus's office building, staring up at the windows as the sun dipped behind the skyline. It took him a long time to walk inside. When he finally entered, Marcus was waiting. His office was sleek, modern, glass walls, clean lines, a view of the city they had once dreamed of changing together. Marcus stood from behind his desk, smiling as if nothing had changed. "Eli," he said, arms slightly raised, voice casual. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Elijah didn't smile. He didn't sit. He stayed by the door, hands in his pockets, eyes locked on the man he used to call brother. "You knew I'd find out," he said. Marcus gave a slow shrug. "I figured. You've always been relentless." There was a pause, thick with history. Elijah stepped closer. "You stood beside me in protests. You spoke about justice like it was sacred. And now you're profiting off the same system we swore to tear down." Marcus's expression shifted, the smile fading. "Don't pretend you don't understand how this works, Eli. We tried the clean way. We got ignored. We got beat. We got pushed to the side. So I adapted. I found a seat at the table." Elijah's voice rose, anger bleeding into his words. "You didn't find a seat. You sold out for one. You became exactly what we fought against." Marcus moved around the desk, closer now, his voice sharpening. "And what did you become? A Fed? A man hiding behind a badge while pretending he's still part of the people? You think these white suits are gonna let you clean house? You think this ends with Monroe?" Elijah stepped forward, eyes blazing. "I don't care what they let me do. I'll keep burning through until there's nothing left to hide behind. I didn't come this far to stop because someone I loved forgot who he was." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Marcus let out a slow breath, softer now. "You're not gonna stop, are you?" Elijah shook his head. "Not even close." Marcus gave a slow nod, almost a smile. "Then be careful. Because the deeper you go, the more you'll lose." Later that night, Elijah sat alone in his apartment again, the lights off, the hum of the city outside his window barely audible over the sound of his thoughts. He replayed the day over and over, the press conference, the folder, Marcus's face, those words. "You've only scratched the surface." He wondered how many more names would fall. How many more betrayals he'd have to swallow before the job was done. And for the first time in weeks, he felt something close to fear, not of failure, but of the cost of success. In the days that followed, the DOJ expanded the investigation. Monroe was placed on administrative leave. Subpoenas were issued. Files once sealed under confidential agreements were cracked open. Each one revealed another crack in the wall. Maya worked non-stop, fueled by purpose but wearing exhaustion in her posture. Gloria coordinated with state attorneys, building a network of cases that now stretched beyond Richmond. And Elijah moved like a man who had nothing left to lose, sharp, relentless, unstoppable. But beneath the victories, the city was fraying. Protests reignited. Some chanted Elijah's name, calling him a hero. Others questioned his motives, fueled by doubt and media spin. The narrative fractured. And that fracture spread like a fault line through every part of the community. Elijah found himself pulled into meetings with activists, city council members, even pastors, people demanding answers, clarity, reassurance. But he couldn't give them that. Not yet. Because the truth was still unraveling. And the more he saw, the more he realized that justice wasn't a destination. It was a fight. One that never really ended. One night, after another 12-hour shift of reviewing files and connecting dots, Elijah stood on the rooftop of the federal building, looking out over Richmond's sleeping skyline. Maya joined him, 2 coffees in hand. She passed him one, her fingers brushing his. "You okay?" she asked quietly. Elijah took the cup but didn't answer right away. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Do you ever wonder if we're doing more damage than good?" Maya frowned. "What do you mean?" He turned toward her, his expression weary. "Every truth we uncover breaks something. Every name we expose creates another vacuum. We take down the bad guys, but who fills their place? Are we changing the system, or just rearranging the pieces?" Maya looked out over the city with him, thinking. Then she said, "Maybe the point isn't to fix everything all at once. Maybe the point is to keep pushing so the next generation has something better to work with. Maybe all we're doing is clearing space." Elijah gave a quiet, bitter laugh. "Space for what?" She met his eyes. "For people who haven't given up." They stood there for a long time, not speaking, just letting the weight of everything settle. And somewhere deep inside, Elijah felt something shift. Not a resolution. Not closure. But resolve. A fire that burned steady even through the doubt. Because they weren't done. Not yet. Rain had started to fall in the early hours of the morning, not a dramatic storm but a steady, cleansing drizzle that coated the streets of Richmond in a soft sheen of reflection. Elijah stood at the edge of a city park, watching the water collect on the bronze statue of a civil rights leader whose face had long since been worn down by time and weather. His coat was soaked, but he didn't care. He wasn't there for shelter. He was there for silence, for the kind of stillness that only rain and exhaustion could bring. Behind him, footsteps approached, slow, deliberate, familiar. Maya appeared beside him, holding a single folder, the last of the investigative summaries they'd compiled over the past month. She didn't speak immediately. Just stood there, shoulder to shoulder with him, both of them staring at a city that felt less like home with every secret uncovered. Finally, she held out the folder. Elijah took it and opened it slowly. Inside were documents implicating a local philanthropic foundation, one that had publicly funded youth programs and spoken out against police violence, but privately funneled money to legal defense teams for corrupt officers, ensuring their protection behind closed doors. It wasn't just a betrayal, it was a strategic one. The very organizations meant to help the community were being weaponized to protect the oppressors. Elijah flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just about police," he said quietly. "It never was." Maya nodded. "It's a network. A machine. And it's been running longer than either of us has been alive." They walked slowly back toward the car, neither of them speaking. The silence between them was now something different. Not empty, but full. Full of the weight of knowing. The kind of knowing that breaks something fundamental inside you. The kind of knowing that changes how you see everything. When they arrived back at the office, Gloria was waiting. Her eyes told Elijah everything before she even opened her mouth. "Monroe's gone," she said. "Resigned this morning. No warning. Packed up his office in the middle of the night." Elijah stared at her. "Did he say anything?" Gloria hesitated. "Just one thing. He left a note. Said, some fires aren't meant to be put out, they're meant to burn." Elijah absorbed the words, feeling the truth of them lodged deep in his chest. This wasn't over. It had only changed shape. The men who had held power in the light were disappearing, but the ones who moved in shadow were still at play. And now, without the illusion of transparency, they would be even harder to track. Harder to bring down. Elijah turned toward the board on the wall, now covered in red strings and scribbled notes, photos, and timelines that stretched from local offices to federal agencies. The board had once been a map of corruption. Now it felt like a living organism, constantly shifting, constantly adapting. Later that afternoon, Elijah met with a group of community leaders at a local church. The room was filled with people who had once marched with him, supported him, praised him, but now they looked at him with weary, questioning eyes. Some were angry. Some were afraid. And all of them were desperate for answers. A pastor stood at the front of the room, his voice calm but pointed. Agent Brooks, we supported you because we believed you were one of us. But now our youth centers are closing. Our funding is drying up. You say you're fighting corruption, but our communities are the ones feeling the fallout. When does the healing begin? Elijah took a breath, stepped forward, and looked each person in the eye. I understand your pain. And I won't insult you by pretending I have all the answers. What I can tell you is this: what we're fighting isn't just corruption. It's an illusion. A lie that's been sold to us for decades. They made us believe that justice could coexist with compromise. That progress could be made without sacrifice. But that's not the truth. The truth is messy. It's painful. And sometimes it feels like it's tearing everything down. But what we're doing now, what we've started, it's necessary. Because if we don't face the full depth of this, we'll rebuild on rot. And I won't let that happen. A woman in the back stood up, her voice trembling. But what about our sons? What about the boys who look like you, walk like you, and think this system will never protect them? How do we tell them to believe when everything they see tells them not to? Elijah's voice cracked for the first time as he answered. You don't tell them to believe in the system. You teach them to believe in themselves. And in each other. The system isn't the goal. The people are. There was no applause. No shouting. Just a long silence, and then a slow nod from the pastor. The meeting ended not with resolution, but with something deeper, an understanding. Elijah stepped out into the fading light of day, feeling the weight of every promise he had just made, knowing how fragile trust was, how hard it was to earn, and how easy it was to lose. That night, back at headquarters, Elijah received another message. Same unknown number. This time, just a link. He opened it carefully, routed it through security filters. What came through was a video. Grainy, low-res, but real. It showed a meeting in a dark room, several men seated around a table. Voices distorted, faces blurred. But what they were discussing was crystal clear. Strategies to discredit Elijah. Plans to leak false evidence tying him to extremist groups. Tactics to paint him as unstable, dangerous, unfit to lead. It wasn't just a smear campaign. It was a playbook. And it was already in motion. Elijah sat in the dark, watching the video on loop, absorbing every word. This was the next phase. Not just threats. Not just resistance. But war. They couldn't stop him legally, so they would try to destroy his image, his credibility, his name. And the worst part? Some people would believe them. No matter what he had done. No matter what truth he had exposed. Lies, when repeated enough, became reality for those who needed them to be. He called Maya and Gloria in immediately. Showed them the footage. Neither of them blinked. They'd expected it. Gloria looked him in the eye. They're afraid. That's why they're coming for you personally. Maya stepped forward. So what do we do? Elijah's answer came without hesitation. We go louder. We go wider. We release the files. Every single one. Let the public see it all. No redactions. No filters. If they're going to come for my name, they're going to have to do it in full view of the truth. They worked through the night, assembling everything, audio files, transcripts, financial records, testimonies, timelines. A digital archive. A full dossier of systemic corruption that would be undeniable, even to those who tried to twist it. It was a risk. But it was the only option. The next morning, the files went live. Leaked to journalists, advocacy groups, civil rights lawyers. Within hours, the story exploded. Headlines blazed. Social media erupted. And suddenly, Elijah wasn't alone anymore. Whistleblowers came forward from other cities. Anonymous tips poured in. What started in Richmond became a spark lighting fires in Baltimore, Atlanta, Detroit. A network of voices, all speaking the same truth. This isn't isolated. This is embedded. This is everywhere. And now, we're done being quiet. Elijah sat in his office, watching the world shift in real time. The price of truth was steep. But now, for the first time in his life, he felt something stronger than fear. He felt momentum. He felt the beginning of something that might actually last. And he knew, the reckoning had only just begun. In the months that followed the public release of the federal evidence, Richmond was no longer the same city. What began as a single trial had unraveled into one of the largest internal investigations in modern law enforcement history. Elijah Brooks, once targeted, mocked, and dismissed, had become a national figure, not through ambition or fame-seeking, but through unwavering resolve and a quiet conviction that truth, even when painful, must be confronted head-on. The leaks had done what years of silence could not. They gave people knowledge, and with it, the power to act. Chief Monroe vanished from the public eye after his resignation. He was later found to be living in a private compound out of state, unreachable by most forms of media. Though he was never charged due to a complex network of legal protections he had spent years building, his reputation was irreparably destroyed. He would spend the rest of his days in hiding, his name forever tied to a legacy of betrayal. The community he claimed to serve refused to speak it without disdain. What once was a symbol of leadership had become a cautionary tale of ego, deception, and decay. Marcus Lyle's downfall came in a slower, quieter way. After his ties to city contracts were exposed, his foundation collapsed. Public trust eroded in a matter of weeks. He tried to pivot, attempted to defend himself on talk shows and online platforms, but the community had already made its decision. His betrayal had cut too deep. In a final conversation with Elijah, one held not in rage, but in deep, somber understanding, Marcus admitted what Elijah had always feared: I wanted to be the change man. But somewhere along the way, I started thinking survival was more important than revolution. Elijah didn't answer him with words. He simply walked away, not with bitterness, but with the knowledge that some bridges weren't meant to be rebuilt. Gloria received a promotion, appointed as the lead coordinator for federal oversight programs in urban precincts across the East Coast. Her work with Elijah had sharpened her instincts, and she now used her voice to ensure that no future trial would be silenced by manipulation. Maya, ever loyal, ever sharp, was offered a position in Washington to help lead structural reforms within the Bureau itself. But she turned it down. She stayed in Richmond, choosing to rebuild what had been broken instead of abandoning it. She and Elijah continued working together, not just as colleagues, but as partners in a mission that had grown far beyond either of them. As for Elijah, he didn't return to the same apartment. He moved into a quiet home just outside the city, nothing fancy, but filled with light and space to breathe. Inside, he kept only what mattered. No wall of case files, no clutter of evidence. Just framed photographs of those whose voices had changed everything: Karen Tate, now in college thanks to community support, Gloria and Maya at the press conference that changed it all, and a single quote engraved on a plaque on his desk: "Justice is not an end, it's a beginning." He declined several interview offers, refused book deals and public speaking engagements, choosing instead to invest his time mentoring a new generation of agents and lawyers, many of them young, black, and determined to walk the same path he had walked, but with fewer obstacles in their way. He taught them not just how to investigate, but how to stand. How to speak when silence is safer. How to carry the weight of history without letting it break them. His work was quieter now, but more powerful than ever. One evening, during a youth summit hosted in a converted church downtown, Elijah took the stage, not as a guest of honor, not as a headline, but as a mentor. He told the story of what happened, not with dramatic flair, but with clarity. He didn't paint himself as a hero. Instead, he highlighted the power of collective courage. The bravery of victims who came forward. The quiet strength of those who stood with him when it cost them everything. When he finished, the room was silent, not out of boredom or confusion, but out of deep, unspoken reverence. Then someone stood up, a young girl, no more than 16. She asked, "How did you not give up?" Elijah smiled, the kind of smile earned through struggle. "Because I remembered who I was," he said. "Even when they tried to make me forget." And that was it. The system did not fix itself overnight. The damage ran too deep. But change had started, and it could no longer be stopped. Police departments across the country began implementing mandatory transparency programs. Federal oversight models based on Elijah's work were adopted in multiple states. More officers were held accountable, and most importantly, more communities were heard. What had once been dismissed as a single man's pursuit of justice had become a movement rooted in truth. Now, I want to ask you something. What would you have done in Elijah's place? Would you have stood still while they laughed at your badge? Would you have swallowed the pain and walked away, or would you have found a way to turn that moment of humiliation into a reckoning? Because this isn't just a story about corruption. It's a story about how far a person can go when they refuse to let the world define them by their pain. It's a story about resistance born from dignity, about the cost of silence, and the price of truth. It's about what happens when one person decides that enough is enough, and refuses to flinch. Now I want to hear from you. What part of this story hit you the hardest? What do you think justice looks like in real life, beyond the courtroom speeches and media headlines? Tell us in the comments. We read everything, and your voice matters here. And if this story moved you in any way, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story that just might shake your world. Because the truth, there's always more beneath the surface.